Okay, so in this video, I want to give some data, talk about how Canadian farms have changed over time. So, over the past 90 to 100 years. All right, so let's start with some historical data. This is data from the Canadian Farm Census. It's run by Statistics Canada, and they survey basically every single Canadian farmer. And so the latest census was done in 2021, but I don't yet have access to all of that data. So I'm presenting 2016 census data. A couple of things to note here. One is the farm to total ratio, which is the ratio of Canadians living on farms directly involved in agriculture versus the total number of Canadians living in Canada. And between 1931 and 2016, it's declined from 1 in 3, or 33%, to 1 in 50, or 2%. Okay, so there's a lot less Canadians involved in agriculture, um, and yet food production has just continued to increase. And we've talked a little bit about why previously. The next thing to note is that the number of farms has declined pretty dramatically between 1931 and 2016, having, more than having, in fact, between that time. That said, the number of average acres, basically the average farm size, the number of acres that an individual farm or farm family is operating has almost quadrupled from 224 to 820 acres. So this trend is that we have less farms operating, but the farms that remain are much larger than before. So I think there's two important broad trends to consider thinking about how Canadian cropping systems have changed over the past 90 to 100 years. One broad trend is the decline in crop livestock integration. Okay, so back then it was much more common than it is today to have both crop production and livestock production occurring on the same farm. Right? We have integration of the crop and livestock business units, and quite a bit of synergies were found between those two. And I'll give you three examples of what I mean by those synergies between crop and livestock production that were much more important uh, than they are today. So first is manure as a source of nutrients. So before synthetic fertilizers, manure was a major source of crop nutrients. And so farmers, there was a tremendous benefit for farmers of collecting animal manure and then spreading it on their crop fields. And keep in mind that manure is primarily water. It's very expensive to ship. You can't really transport it very far economically. So it made a lot more sense for farmers to have animals, manure production occurring on their farms close to their fields. Another reason for crop livestock integration was value add. Okay, and that's still true today to some extent. But essentially, what you have is a farmer who says, okay, I can sell my corn on the market, or I can feed that corn to chickens and then sell some eggs for more money, or feed that corn to beef and then sell my cows or whatnot. And so feeding your crops to your livestock was a form of business value added, right? It was potential for more profit. Okay, so it often made sense to have some animals for that reason. And the third reason is because livestock makes effective use of forages. Okay, so forage refers to grasses or legumes that are consumed whole by an animal. So that can be something like pasture, hay fields, hay for hay or haylage. We'll talk a little bit more about forages, but forages could be grown on land that was unsuitable for crop production. So back in the 1930s, before land improvement, that we were missing technologies like, drainage, for example. Quite a bit of the land base simply could not support crop production. And so if you owned livestock, you could more effectively monetize and make money from land that you couldn't crop, right? You could plant a forage and then actually use that forage to feed animals. Another broad change in Canadian cropping systems from the 1930s to today was a simplification of crop rotations. And again, crop rotation is the sequence of crops over time, year after year, grown on an individual field. And in the past, crop rotations were much more diverse. They included a wider range of crops. Okay, and there was a number of reasons for that. Um, Number one, farms typically had smaller fields, and that meant that they could rotate multiple crops in the same year. Okay, so in a given year, they would have different fields that were planted to different crops, and that was important for risk mitigation. Now, what do I mean by risk mitigation, and how does crop rotation influence that? Well, this was again back in the day before synthetic herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. And so it was entirely possible if you grew only one crop that you could get, whatever, a disease or an insect pest come and destroy everything. And so to avoid that, to minimize the risk of a complete crop failure, one would grow different kinds of crops, right? Because if a disease wiped out most of your corn, well, you had other crops that could provide you with, a means to make a living. Okay, it was also important to spread out labor requirements over the season. Okay, because different crops, for example, are harvested at different times. And again, before, in the 1930s, mechanization was not as common. And so it was just more labor intensive to, for example, harvest a crop. And so if you could have one crop, such as, say, winter wheat, that you could harvest in mid-July or towards the end of July. If you had a crop like oats that you could harvest towards the end of August, a crop like soybeans, which you could harvest towards the end of September, a crop like corn, you could harvest towards the end of October. You get the picture. If you can spread out those labor requirements, I mean, that's what's necessary, again, if you are not mechanized, right? You don't have a gigantic machine that allows you to harvest multiple acres an hour, which farmers in the 1930s did not. So more diverse rotations were also important for nutrient supply and weed management. So again, before synthetic fertilizers, growing legumes which provided residual nitrogen to the next crop, growing something like an alfalfa forage or something like clover, red clover, that would allow you, the next crop that was grown after, to have more nitrogen and therefore higher yields. And again, also, just for weed management, again, before herbicides, crop rotation allowed farmers to more effectively deal with weeds. So the drivers of this trend towards larger farm sizes in Canada, indeed also in the United States and many other parts of the world, are quite numerous, right? And they include reasons like mechanization, just the fact that, we have larger tractors, larger tillage equipment and harvest equipment, and so an individual farmer or farm family can manage more land, right? That's one obvious reason compared to the 1930s. And there's a number of economic reasons, right? The ability to, for example, spread out capital costs across a larger land base. Okay, so there's a number of reasons why farms are getting larger and larger, and they're economic as well as technological, but they're beyond largely the scope of this course. The simplification of crop rotation is another broad trend that we've seen in Canadian cropping systems. Just a lower diversity of crops being grown overall, and just more simpler rotations comprising less crops being grown in sequence on a field. That's driven in part by technological changes. So synthetic fertilizers and herbicides have reduced the necessity of having complex rotations. Corn, soybean, then wheat, then a forage for a couple of years, going back to corn, for example. The specialization and separation of crop and livestock production has also contributed to this simplification. I mean, if you don't have livestock, then it doesn't make sense to have a forage crop in your rotation. One exception I should mention here, because we're in Ontario, is the horse hay market. So quite a bit of hay is grown in Ontario for that ends up in places like Florida or the Middle East. And that's basically hay grown almost as a cash crop. It's sold off farm, again, to a high value market. Economies of scale and investment, again, is another reason for the simplification of rotation. So if you have to buy a very, very expensive piece of equipment, for example, specific to corn production, as an example, then you're probably going to grow a lot of corn, right? Because you just bought this expensive piece of equipment that's specific to growing corn. And so there's economies of scale in terms of growing a lower number of crops. You can invest in more crop specific equipment and get a better return. Okay, so if you're only investing in corn and soybean equipment, for example, then it doesn't make as much sense to grow a third kind of crop. Another reason for the simplification of crop rotations, perhaps in Ontario, is government programs, and we can debate, how important government programs are to this trend of simplification of rotations. But for example, in Ontario, 5% of all automotive fuel sold in the province has to be made comprise 5% ethanol, and that ethanol is made of corn. And so, because of a government program, there's a huge market for corn in this province. Okay, and so there's government programs that are influencing crop rotations, of course. Another driver is market demand. So I'll just give you an example: oats. Right, oats used to be about 25% of acreage in North America, and that was because we had a lot of horses. But with the advent of the automobile, basically the gas engine, well, we don't need as many oats, right? There's not as much horses, and so the oat acreage is plummeted, right? It's probably not even 1% in Ontario anymore, and so we have a change in market demand towards specific kinds of crops. And the next thing I want to mention is the percentage of rented land, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the agronomy of crop rotation, but overall, crop rotations offer long-term soil benefits, okay, in terms of soil fertility, soil structure, and that long-term benefit is not going to be realized if you're just renting land. And so as more and more farmers are renting land as opposed to owning land, or as more of their farm is comprised of rented land, the incentive to have a complex crop rotation for those long-term benefits, those soil benefits, it's just not there because the owner of that land can just decide not to rent it to them anymore.